Welcome to the investigation of a cold case that remained silent for 34 years, hidden within the archives of Riverside County. Tonight, we examine the precise sequence of events that transformed a collection of forgotten evidence into a name, utilizing the files of Detective Robert Miller and the eventual breakthroughs of forensic genealogy. The discovery began not with a siren, but with a stumbled step on a ridge overlooking the Santa Ana River. On the morning of November 14, 1984, two hikers were traversing the steep, scrub-covered incline of a drainage wash 3 miles north of the city limits. The terrain here was unforgiving, a mixture of loose shale and dry, brittle sagebrush that snagged on clothing. At 8:14 a.m., the lead hiker, a local man named Gary H., lost his footing near a cluster of boulders. As he reached out to steady himself against the rock face, his gaze dropped to a recession in the earth, partially obscured by a growth of wild buckwheat. He saw a flash of color that did not belong in the monochrome palette of the desert winter. It was a bright, distinct blue. Gary pushed aside the brush. The blue object was fabric. It was a heavy cotton blend, partially buried in the sand. He pulled at the edge of the material, expecting to find discarded trash or a lost backpack. Instead, the shifting sand revealed the curvature of a human bone. The hikers retreated immediately to the access road and flagged down a passing motorist to contact the Riverside Sheriff's Department. Detective Robert Miller received the dispatch at 9:05 a.m. He was sitting at his desk in the chaotic bullpen of the station, organizing a stack of theft reports. Miller was a man of routine. He kept his pencils sharpened to a uniform length, and his case files aligned perfectly with the edge of his metal desk. He was 42 years old, midway through a career defined by a quiet, persistent adherence to procedure. He did not believe in intuition. He believed in documentation. He arrived at the scene 40 minutes later. The patrol officers had already taped off a 50-foot perimeter around the boulders. Miller ducked under the yellow tape, his polished shoes crunching softly on the gravel. He carried a standard-issue clipboard and a fresh logbook, the Riverside Ledger, which would become the primary repository for every fact associated with the case for the next 3 decades. Miller approached the depression in the earth. The medical examiner had not yet arrived, leaving Miller to conduct the initial survey. He did not touch the remains. He stood 5 feet away, clicking his pen, and began to write. Entry 1, 0950 hours. Location, North Ridge, Sector 4. Weather, clear, dry. Temperature, 62 degrees. He noted the position of the body. It was not a complete skeleton. Scavengers and the elements had scattered the remains over a 10-yard radius. However, the torso remained largely intact, clad in the remnants of the blue garment the hikers had spotted. Miller squinted, leaning in slightly without disturbing the soil. The fabric appeared to be a blouse, perhaps a handmade modification of a standard shirt. The stitching was uneven. He looked for personal effects. There was no purse. There were no shoes visible near the primary site. There was no identification. The woman, and the pelvic structure suggested it was likely a woman, had been stripped of her name long before she was found. Miller signaled to the crime scene photographer. "I want wide shots of the ridgeline first," Miller said, his voice level. "Then grid the area. Every rock, every twig within 10 feet of the central mass." The camera shutter clicked, a mechanical sound that rhythmically punctuated the silence of the canyon. Miller continued his documentation. He noted a small, metallic object half buried near the left side of the remains. He donned latex gloves and retrieved a pair of sterile forceps from his kit. With the care of a watchmaker, he lifted the object. It was a zipper pull, cheap, brass-plated metal. He placed it into an evidence bag, sealed it, and labeled it. Item 04, metal fragment. For the next 6 hours, Miller oversaw the excavation of the scene. The process was slow and methodical. They sifted the dirt through wire mesh screens, looking for teeth, buttons, or jewelry. They found nothing that could directly identify the deceased. The lack of clues was, in itself, a piece of data. It suggested a death that had occurred in isolation, or a disposal of the body meant to ensure anonymity. By late afternoon, the coroner's van had navigated the rocky access road. The remains were placed into a body bag. As the zipper closed, obscuring the blue fabric, Miller felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. This was case number 1984-1211. He did not know that he would carry this number into his retirement. The initial autopsy was conducted 2 days later, on November 16, 1984. The pathology lab was a sterile, tiled room that smelled of formaldehyde and floor wax. Miller stood in the observation corner, his ledger open. The medical examiner, Dr. Aris, was a blunt man who preferred silence. He worked over the skeletal remains, measuring and cataloguing. After an hour, he stepped back and pulled down his mask. "Female," Aris said. "Age range is difficult given the weathering, but the epiphyseal fusion suggests she was fully grown but young, late teens to mid-30s. Miller wrote, "Subject, female, approx age 18 to 35. "Cause of death?" Miller asked. "Indeterminate," Aris replied, gesturing to the incomplete nature of the skeleton. "No obvious trauma to the skull, no bullet defects in the remaining bones. Hyoid bone is missing, so strangulation can't be confirmed or ruled out. It's been too long, Bob. She's been out there at least a year, maybe 2. Miller nodded. "Race?" "Likely Caucasian, possibly mixed ancestry. The skull measurements are ambiguous." Then came the issue of identification. In 1984, the toolbox of forensic science was largely analog. It relied on physical matching, fingerprints, dental records, and visual identification. "Fingerprints?" Miller asked, though he knew the answer. "The hands are gone," Aris said. "Scavengers." "Serology?" Aris shook his head. "We can try to extract a blood type from the marrow, but with this level of degradation and heat exposure, it's a long shot. And even if we get a type, say she's type O, that narrows it down to about 40% of the population. It's not a name." The limitation of serology was the great barrier of the era. Biological evidence was categorized by what it wasn't, rather than exactly who it was. They could tell if the victim was not a match for a specific missing person if the blood types clashed, but they could not positively identify her through blood alone. Miller said. Aris replied. Miller corrected, his tone sharpening slightly. Miller didn't know why he emphasized it. Perhaps it was the handmade stitching on the blue blouse. It spoke of someone trying to make something beautiful out of something plain. It humanized the bones. He wanted to ensure that if a better method ever arrived, there would be something left to test. The investigation moved from the morgue to the filing cabinet. Miller returned to the station and began the process of cross-referencing. He pulled the binders for missing persons in Riverside County for the years 1982 through 1984. He sat under the buzzing fluorescent lights, flipping through plastic-sheathed pages, photographs of smiling women at birthday parties, driver's license photos, school portraits. He looked for the gap-toothed smile or the specific height that might match Jane Doe 1984. He spent weeks contacting neighboring jurisdictions, San Bernardino, Los Angeles, Orange County. He sent teletypes, the precursor to digital databases, asking for information on missing females fitting the broad description. The tips trickled in, but they were vague. A runaway from Barstow, a drifter seen hitchhiking near the 91 freeway. Each lead required a phone call, a request for records, and a comparison. In early 1986, a glimmer of possibility emerged. A detective from Nevada contacted Miller regarding a missing woman named, quote, 19, who had vanished from Las Vegas in late 1983. The timeline fit. The physical description, 5 feet 5 inches, blonde hair, was consistent with the few strands found at the scene. Miller felt the quickening pulse of a potential match. He requested the dental records immediately. When the large manila envelope arrived from Nevada, Miller didn't open it at his desk. He took it to the break room, poured a cup of black coffee, and sat at the small round table. He wanted to be right. He wanted to close the file. He opened the envelope and spread the dental charts out. He compared them with the post-mortem charts Dr. Aris had created for Jane Doe. He looked at the molars. Jane Doe had a distinct filling in her lower left mandible, a silver amalgam restoration. He scanned the Nevada chart. The missing woman, Sarah, had perfect teeth in that quadrant. No fillings. Miller stared at the papers for a long time. The match was impossible. The Nevada woman was not the woman in the blue blouse. He folded the charts back into the envelope. The surge of adrenaline faded, replaced by the dull ache of the dead end. He walked back to the records room and filed the Nevada report under excluded. Years began to dissolve into the routine of police work. 1986 became 1990. 1990 became 1995. The box labelled 1984-1211 moved physically within the records room. Initially, it sat on the active shelf near eye level. As new murders and new disappearances occurred, the box was shifted to a lower shelf. Eventually, it migrated to the long-term storage rows in the basement, an area nicknamed the catacombs by the junior officers. But Miller did not forget. Every November 14th, the anniversary of the discovery, he went downstairs. He would pull the box, blow the dust off the cardboard lid, and read through his original notes in the ledger. Blue fabric, heavy cotton, uneven stitching. He would verify that the physical evidence, the fabric, the zipper pull, and the biological samples was still accounted for. He checked the seals on the evidence bags. He annoyed the evidence clerk, a woman named Janice, with his persistence. "It's been 10 years, Bob," quote, "nobody is looking for her. I am," quote, "DNA," quote, "give me this one," quote, "I've carried this box for 15 years. Let me try." The chief granted the request. Miller personally retrieved the sample from the deep freeze. The bone fragment was placed in a specialized transport container. He filled out the chain of custody forms with a handwriting that was slightly shakier than it had been in 1984, but just as precise. He mailed the package and waited. The wait in 1999 was not measured in days, but in months. The labs were backlogged, and cold cases took the lowest priority. Miller checked his mailbox every morning. Finally, on a Tuesday in late October, a thin envelope from the Department of Justice arrived. Miller sat at his desk. The station had changed around him. Computers had replaced typewriters. The younger detectives talked about cell phone triangulation. Miller felt like an artifact, much like the case he was holding. He used a letter opener to slice the envelope. He unfolded the single sheet of report paper. He skipped the technical preamble and looked for the results section at the bottom. Sample ID 1984-1211-femur. Analysis: polymerase chain reaction, PCR, amplification attempted. Result: failed. Notes: the sample is severely degraded due to environmental exposure and age. Insufficient high molecular weight DNA present for current STR profiling methods. No profile generated. Miller read the line again. Insufficient. The desert had done its work too well. The heat, the sun, and the time had shredded the genetic code inside the bone into useless confetti. The science of the 20th century had advanced, but not enough to read the ghost in the machine. Miller felt a heavy, hollow sensation in his chest. He had hoped this would be the key. Instead, the door remained locked. He took the report and the original ledger. He walked down to the basement archives. The air was cool and smelled of old paper. He found the box. He placed the rejection letter on top of the stack of documents, directly over the exclusion report from Nevada. He closed the lid. He stood there for a moment in the dim light, his hand resting on the cardboard. "Not yet," he whispered to the silence. He turned off the light and walked back up the stairs, leaving the woman in the blue blouse in the dark, waiting for a future that hadn't been invented yet. The turn of the millennium came not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of server fans and the click of new keyboards. The Y2K panic fizzled into nothingness, much like the lead on the Jane Doe. The world moved on, obsessed with the future, while Miller remained anchored in the past, a ship listed heavily in stagnant waters. The year 2000 brought budget cuts and a shift in departmental priorities. The focus turned to narcotics, to the streets, to the immediate and the visceral violence of the living. The dead, particularly the anonymous dead, found in the scrubland 15 years prior, were afforded no lobby, no voice, and no funding. The box in the basement gathered a fine layer of grey dust, the specific, particulate matter of a government building that never truly sleeps, but is always slowly decaying. Miller's retirement party was held in the break room in the spring of 2003. It was a modest affair. There was a sheet cake from the grocery store with blue icing that spelled out, "Good luck," and a pot of coffee that had been stewing since the early shift. The younger officers, the ones who wore their vests differently and spoke in codes Miller found abrasive, shook his hand with genuine, if detached, respect. To them, he was a legend, but a legend from a black and white era, a dinosaur walking toward the tar pits. The chief handed him a plaque. It was heavy, imitation walnut, with a brass plate listing his years of service, 1968 to 2003, 35 years, a lifetime of chasing shadows. "You've earned the rest, Frank," quote, 32. "Go fishing, annoyance the wife," quote, 33. "I'm a widower," Miller said softly. The chief blinked, the smile faltering for a microsecond before reassembling. "Right, sorry. Well, enjoy the freedom. You're out of the grind." Quote, 35. Doe Network, quote, 36. Web sleuths, quote, 37. Submit, quote, 38. "Have you looked at missing persons Cynthia K. from Tucson?" Quote, 39. "Sarah," quote, 40. "It's Frank." "Hey, Frank," Vance would reply. She was patient, kind. She understood the weight of the badge, even if she hadn't carried it as long. "What have you got?" "Check a Cynthia K., Tucson PD, case number 84-9921.
Dentals look close. I'll pull it, Frank. Give me a week."
"It's a no-go, Frank," Vance would say, her voice soft with the news. "Cynthia turned up alive in 88, living in Phoenix under a married name, didn't tell her folks." "Okay," Miller would say, the hollow feeling returning to his chest, familiar as an old coat. "Okay, thanks, Sarah." "Frank?" "Yeah?" "Why don't you come down for coffee sometime? Just coffee, no files." "Sure, kid. Sometime." "It's been 30 years, Frank," she said. "The bone is still there," Miller said, "in the deep freeze, Section D." "I know the case. Detective Vance keeps it active." "The science has changed, Chief. 1999 was the Stone Age compared to now. There's a lab in Texas. They're doing mitochondrial work. If we can get a profile, we can upload it to CODIS. Maybe a sibling has been arrested. Maybe a direct match came in from another state." "It costs money, Frank. Outsourcing to private labs isn't in the budget." "I'll pay for it," Miller said. Alvarez stopped. She looked at the old man, saw the tremor in his hands, the desperate clarity in his eyes. "You can't do that. Chain of custody, conflicts of interest. The city can't accept private funds for forensic testing from a civilian." "I'm not a civilian, quote. I'm the lead investigator. I clocked out for a while." Alvarez sighed. She tapped her pen on the desk. "I can't promise the Texas lab, but the state lab has upgraded their sequencers. They have a new grant for cold cases. I'll authorize a resubmission. One shot." Miller felt a surge of emotion so strong he thought his heart might stutter. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Wait for the results." "I'm coming over, Frank," she said. "Just tell me." "I'm coming over. They got a profile." "They did?" "Mitochondrial. It's beautiful. High quality. The new extraction method worked wonders. They dissolved the bone powder completely." "And?" Miller looked at the folder. "Who is she?" Vance hesitated. She placed a hand on Miller's trembling arm. "It's not that simple, Frank, you know that. They got a profile, but there's no match in CODIS." "No match. She's not in the system. And neither is her mother, or her grandmother, or her sisters. We ran it against the national database. We ran it against the missing persons reference samples. Nothing. So we have a fingerprint, but no one to check it against. We have her DNA, Frank. That's huge. It means if her family ever comes forward, if they ever give a sample, we identify her instantly. It's a win. It's a massive win. It's a half measure, Miller muttered. It's a bridge to nowhere. It's hope. We uploaded it to the national index. It stays there forever. We don't have to worry about the bone degrading anymore.
Her code is digital now. It's immortal. Immortal, but still nameless. Genetic genealogy. They used a public genealogy database called GEDmatch. They built a family tree. Sarah. Did you see it? I saw it, Frank. I'm already typing the request. GEDmatch, Miller said, testing the word. Can we do it? It's the Wild West right now. Legally, it's grey. But the FBI is jumping on it. The Golden State case changed everything overnight. I need to get the chief's approval to hire a specialist, a genetic genealogist. Do it, Miller rasped. Whatever it takes. It might cost. I don't care about the cost. Find the money, or I will sell this house. I'll find the money, Frank. I promise. I'm on it.
We're in. We contracted with a lab in Virginia, Parabon Nanolabs. They're taking the profile we generated in 2015. They have to do some reprocessing to make it compatible with the genealogy databases, SNP genotyping, not just STRs. But the sample quality is good enough. How long? They're building the tree. It depends on the matches. If we get a second cousin, it's fast. If we only get fifth cousins, it takes time. I don't have time, Sarah. I'm running out of runway. You hang on, Vance commanded, her voice fierce. You hang on, Frank Miller.
We are going to give her her name back.
The months dragged. October, November, December. Christmas came and went. Miller sat in the common room, watching the other residents open gifts from grandchildren. He held a cup of lukewarm tea. He thought about the desert. He thought about the cold ground. He wondered if the woman in the blue blouse had liked Christmas. January 2019. Miller was bedridden now. The pneumonia had hit him hard. He drifted in and out of sleep. In his dreams, he was young again, walking the ravine. But this time, the woman wasn't a skeleton. She was standing there, whole, looking at him. He tried to ask her name, but the wind took his voice. On a Tuesday morning in February, the door to his room opened. It was Detective Vance. She was wearing her dress blues. She held a folder. She wasn't smiling. She looked solemn.
Tears shimmering in her eyes.
She pulled a chair up to the bed. She took Miller's hand. It was cold and dry. "Frank?" she whispered. Miller opened his eyes. They were cloudy, but they focused on her face. "Sarah?" "We found her." The air in the room seemed to stop moving. The hum of the medical equipment faded away. "We found a second cousin in Oklahoma," Vance said, her voice trembling. "We built the tree back to great-grandparents in the 1920s. Then we came forward. We found a family that had a daughter who ran away in 1983. They never reported her missing because she sent a postcard saying she was going to California to be an actress and didn't want to be found. They thought she was living her life. The name. Her name was Elena. Eleanor Marie Davis. She was 19. Her brother is still alive. He's coming tomorrow to claim her. He gave a DNA sample to confirm. It's a 100% match.
We're releasing the remains.
She's going home to Oklahoma, Frank." Miller let out a long, shuddering breath. The tension that had held his body together for 35 years seemed to unravel. The heavy box he had carried, the invisible weight that had bent his spine and greyed his hair, was gone. He looked at the photo of Eleanor one last time. He memorized her smile. "Eleanor," he whispered. "Hello, Eleanor." "You did it, Frank," Vance said, weeping openly now. "You brought her home." Miller smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes. "No, the science did it. You did it. I just kept the light on." He turned his head to the pillow. He felt incredibly tired, but it was a good tired. The kind of tired that comes after a long day's work is finally, truly finished. "Thank you, Sarah," he murmured. I think
I can sleep now."
Vance sat with him for a long time.
She watched the rise and fall of his chest. She watched the peace settle over his face, smoothing out the lines of worry and obsession. Outside, the world continued to spin. Satellites orbited the Earth, data streamed through fiber-optic cables, and the desert wind blew through the ravine where a girl had once lain forgotten. But she was forgotten no more. Frank Miller closed the case, and then, quietly, he closed his eyes. Robert Miller signed his name on the bottom line of the chain of custody log, the ballpoint pen digging into the carbon paper. He pressed hard, ensuring the duplicate copy would be legible. The date was October 14th, 2001. "That's the last of them," the evidence clerk said, sliding a cardboard banker's box across the metal counter. Case 1984-1211.
The Jane Doe.
Miller placed both hands on the box. It was lighter than he expected. 30 years of a human life, or rather the lack of one, contained in a space 12 inches wide and 15 inches long. He lifted it. The cardboard was soft at the corners, worn down by years of being shuffled from one shelf to another in the basement of the Riverside precinct. "Thanks, Jerry," Miller said. "Good luck with it, detective."
That one's been gathering dust since before I started.
Miller carried the box down the hallway, past the bustling bullpen where the younger detectives were processing the morning's arrests, and turned left into the newly established cold case unit. It was a quiet room, repurposed from an old storage office. The air smelled of stale coffee and floor wax. There were no windows, only the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the low whir of a computer tower fan. He set the box on his desk. He did not sit down immediately. Instead, he took a pair of latex gloves from the dispenser on the wall, snapped them onto his hands, and removed the lid. The smell hit him first. Not unpleasant, just old. It was the scent of dry paper and confined air. Inside, the contents were organized in manila envelopes, the edges yellowed and brittle. Miller picked up the first envelope. It was labeled Scene Photography. He opened the clasp and slid the glossy black and white prints onto the desk. The ravine looked different in 1984. The brush was thicker. The body was almost invisible in the wide shots, just a disruption in the pattern of the desert scrub. In the close-ups, the reality of the case asserted itself. Skeletal remains, scattered, weathered. He set the photos aside and reached for the second envelope. Personal effects. This was what he needed to see. Photographs could be distanced, but objects held weight. He withdrew a plastic evidence bag. Inside lay a scrap of blue fabric. It was denim, frayed at the edges, stiff with age and the dried remnants of soil. The label attached to the bag read, Item 4, fragment of blue denim trousers, found approximately 3 meters from primary site. Miller held the bag up to the light. The weave of the denim was tight. It wasn't a designer brand, or at least there were no tags to indicate one, just utility, workwear, or perhaps just cheap jeans bought at a department store that no longer existed. He put the denim down and picked up the next item, a copy of the Riverside Ledger. The newspaper was dated 3 days before the discovery of the body. It had been found weighted down by a rock near the ravine edge. The paper was brown now, fragile as dried leaves. The headline spoke of a city council meeting and a local high school football victory. Miller sat down. He stared at the objects, the denim, the paper. The bones were not here. They were stored in the medical examiner's secure facility, preserved in a climate-controlled locker. But these items were the ghosts of the girl's last day. "Who were you?" Miller asked the silent room. He wasn't Frank. He knew that. Frank had carried this case until his heart gave out, obsessing over the details until they blurred together. Robert Miller was different. He was methodical. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in procedure. The year was 2001, and the world was changing. Technology was no longer a luxury in police work. It was the foundation. He turned to his computer. The monitor flickered as he woke it up. He opened a new file and typed the case number, 1984-1211. He began to type, transferring the handwritten notes from the original 1984 police report into the digital database.
Victim, female. Age estimate, 17 to 23. Height estimate, 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 6 inches. Dr. Chen, we got your request on the Jane Doe samples. And? We can try, but you have to understand the limitations. The samples we have on file from the original autopsy are poor. They didn't have PCR back then. The bone fragments were handled by half a dozen people before they were sealed. I know, Miller said, but we have CODIS now. If we can get a profile, we can run it against the national database. She might have a sister who was arrested for a DUI in Ohio, or a father in the system for burglary. That's the hope, but CODIS requires a certain number of markers to accept a profile. We need 13 distinct loci to generate a valid upload. With bone this old, exposed to the desert heat for who knows how long, the DNA degrades. It breaks into tiny pieces, sometimes too small to read. Just run it. Use the femur section. It's the densest bone. If there's anything left, it'll be in there. All right, but it'll take weeks, maybe months. We're backed up with current cases. I'm not going anywhere. Neither is she. Results. Not today. I've got a girl. Went missing in late '83. Name was Cynthia. Cynthia Higgins. 19 years old. Ran off with a boyfriend. Family never heard from her again. The timeline fits your Jane Doe. Miller felt the familiar spike of adrenaline. It was a dangerous chemical in cold case work. It made you see things that weren't there. Description? Miller asked, pen hovering over his notepad. 5 feet 5 inches. Quote, 152, quote. Riverside was right on that path. Quote, 153, quote, Miller said. The package from Reno arrived 2 days later. It contained a grainy photo of a girl with feathered hair and a defiant smile. She looked like the type of girl who would get into a car with a stranger. She looked like 1,000 other girls from 1983. Miller pulled the autopsy report for Jane Doe, 1984. He turned to the dental charts. The medical examiner in 1984 had been thorough. He had charted every filling, every rotation. Jane Doe had perfect teeth. No fillings, no extractions, just a slight crowding in the lower incisors. Miller opened the file for Cynthia Higgins. He found the dental records provided by her family dentist in Reno. Cynthia Higgins. Amalgam restoration, tooth number 3. Amalgam restoration, tooth number 14. Tooth number 30 extracted due to decay. Miller stared at the two charts side by side. Jane Doe had a full set of pristine teeth. Cynthia Higgins had a mouthful of silver fillings and a missing molar. They were not the same person. Miller felt the crash. It was physical, a heaviness in the chest. He picked up the photo of Cynthia Higgins. Somewhere her family was still waiting, but she wasn't in his box. He called the Reno detective. "It's not a match," he said flatly. "Dental excludes her." "Damn," the voice on the other end said. "I thought we had that one." "Keep looking," Miller said. "I will too." He filed the Cynthia Higgins report in a subfolder labeled Exclusions. It was becoming the thickest folder in the box. Time moved faster now. 2008, 2010, 2012. The world outside the precinct changed. Smartphones replaced flip phones. Social media exploded. People began sharing their lives online, creating digital footprints that would never fade. But Jane Doe, 1984, had died before the internet. Her footprint was in the dust of a ravine. Miller's hair was fully grey now. He required reading glasses to decipher the small print on the case files. He was approaching 60, and the word retirement was being whispered in the hallways, directed at him. He ignored it. He had a shelf of closed cases behind him, a career of successes, but the cardboard box on the corner of his desk remained his anchor. In 2015, the science shifted again. Miller attended a seminar in Sacramento on advanced DNA techniques in cold cases. The speaker was a woman named Dr. Sarah Thorne. She was younger than Miller expected, perhaps in her late 30s, with sharp features
and an intensity that commanded the room. She didn't talk about CODIS. She talked about something else. Thorne told the room of tired detectives. She clicked a remote, changing the slide. It showed a diagram of a family tree. She continued. Miller sat up straighter. Thorne said, "It was called Forensic Genetic Genealogy." After the seminar, Miller waited by the podium. Thorne was packing up her laptop. Miller said. She looked up. Her eyes were grey and assessing. He handed her his card. Thorne took the card. Thorne paused. Miller asked. She said. Miller said. Thorne said. It took 2 years to get the funding and the authorization. Bureaucracy was slower than science. By the time the approval came through, it was early 2018. Miller drove the sample to the private lab himself. He didn't trust the mail. He met Dr. Thorne in a facility that looked more like a tech startup than a police station. There were glass walls, ergonomic chairs, and machines that hummed with a quiet, expensive efficiency. Thorne met him in the lobby. She wore a white lab coat over a silk blouse. She looked tired, but her eyes were bright. "You brought it?" Miller held up the evidence-sealed bag. Inside was the remaining section of the femur. It looked like a dry, grey stone. "This is it," Miller said. "The last shot." Thorne took the bag. She handled it with reverence. "We're going to use a new extraction method," she explained as she walked him toward the secure intake area. "It was developed for ancient DNA, identifying kings in parking lots and Neanderthals in caves. It chemically unlocks the DNA bound to the calcium in the bone." "I don't need to know how the engine works, Doc," Miller said. "I just need the car to start." "It's not just about the extraction, Robert," Thorne said, switching to his first name. "It's about the database work afterwards. That's the hard part, the genealogy. Explain it to me." They stood by a large window looking into the sequencing room. Machines with flashing lights were processing trays of vials. "If we get a profile," Thorne said, "I upload it to GEDmatch. I check a box that says this is a law enforcement kit. Then I wait. The computer compares your Jane Doe's DNA against millions of people who have uploaded their own data. And if we get a match—" "We won't get a direct match," Thorne corrected. "That would be a miracle. We'll get distant matches, people who share less than 1% of their DNA with her, third cousins twice removed, people who don't even know she existed." "And then?" "Then I become a different kind of detective," Thorne said. "I use census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses. I build trees. I look for where the lines intersect. I look for a couple in the 1940s or 50s who had a granddaughter who vanished." Miller watched the machines. "It sounds like a needle in a stack of needles." "It is," Thorne said. "But we have magnets now." She signed for the evidence. "Go home, Robert. This part takes time. The sequencing alone will take weeks. Then the bioinformatics. Don't call me. I'll call you." Miller left the lab. The California sun was bright and harsh. He drove back to Riverside, the empty passenger seat feeling strangely heavy. He had given away the physical anchor of the case. Now, she was just data. Spring turned to summer. The Golden State Killer case broke in April 2018. It was a seismic shift. They had used genetic genealogy to catch a monster who had evaded capture for 40 years. Suddenly, everyone knew what Dr. Thorne was doing. The phone at the cold case unit began to ring off the hook, with reporters asking if Riverside was using the new technique. Miller deflected the calls. "We are pursuing all leads," he would say, and hang up. He didn't want to jinx it. He felt a superstitious dread that if he spoke about it, the fragile thread would snap. On a Tuesday in August, Miller was cleaning out his desk. He was 62. His retirement papers were signed. His last day was Friday. He was sorting through 20 years of pens, paperclips, and old notes. The phone rang. He looked at the caller ID. "Thorne, Sarah." He let it ring twice before picking up. His hand was steady, but his heart hammered against his ribs. 204, he said. Thorne's voice was calm, almost too calm. "She said." Miller closed his eyes. Thorne said. Thorne said. Miller asked. Miller said. Thorne said softly.
Miller sat in the silence of the cold case unit. He could hear Thorne typing on the other end. He heard the click of a mouse. She said. Miller looked at the empty spot on his desk where the box used to be. He thought of the blue fabric. He thought of the girl alone in the dark ravine. "We're coming," he thought. "Hold on." 50%, Thorne said after 10 minutes.
Miller didn't speak. He watched the second hand on the wall clock sweep around. Tick, tick, tick.
Thorne said. Her voice tightened. Miller held his breath. Thorne said. Miller asked. There was a long pause. He heard Thorne exhale. It sounded like a sigh of frustration. She said. Thorne said. Miller felt the familiar weight settle back onto his shoulders. Thorne said. Thorne said. Miller asked. Thorne said. Thorne admitted. Miller said. Thorne said. Miller said. Thorne said, her voice finding its steel again. Miller said. Thorne said. Thorne said. Miller said. Miller hung up the phone. He sat for a long moment in the quiet office. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. He picked up the blue fabric evidence bag one last time, turning it over in his hands. The DNA was out there. It was floating in the digital ether, a string of letters and numbers seeking a partner. A partial profile, untethered, drifting through a sea of data. He placed the bag back in the box. He put the lid on. He didn't tape it shut. He turned off the computer monitor. The screen went black, the reflection showing an old man in a cheap suit.
Robert Miller stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the cold case unit, leaving the door slightly ajar.
The corridor outside the cold case unit was dim, the fluorescent tubes humming with a dying, insectoid buzz that Miller had ceased to notice 15 years ago. Now, in the silence of the evening, it sounded like a countdown. He walked past the bulletin boards, cluttered with outdated union notices and flyers for picnics that had happened 3 summers prior, his footsteps heavy on the scuffed linoleum. He didn't look back at the ajar door. To look back was to admit hesitation, and Miller had no room for hesitation, not with Friday looming like a sheer cliff edge. The main squad room was a ghost town, populated only by the glow of standby monitors and the cleaning crew moving like spectres between the desks. Ramirez, the night shift sergeant, looked up from a sandwich that smelled of heavy onions and despair. "Calling it, Miller?" Ramirez asked, chewing slowly.
"Calling it," Miller grunted, not stopping. "Big day Friday. Cake in the break room at 2.
"I heard. Don't miss it. The captain ordered the good frosting." Miller raised a hand in a vague wave and pushed through the double doors, out into the humid embrace of the parking garage. The air here was thick with exhaust and the metallic tang of impending rain. He found his sedan, a grey thing that blended into the concrete so well he sometimes lost it, and unlocked the door with a manual twist of the key. The mechanism was stiff, like him. He sat behind the wheel for a long time before turning the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, then settled into a rhythmic rattle. He didn't pull out immediately. Instead, he stared at the concrete pillar in front of him, seeing not the stained grey surface, but the microscopic helixes Thorne had described. 45 centimorgans. It was a terrifyingly small number. It was a whisper in a hurricane. It meant the connection between the donor and his Jane Doe was so diluted by time and marriage and migration that it barely registered as a pulse. Yet, it was the only pulse they had. He put the car in reverse. The drive home was a blur of sodium vapor lights and the slick sheen of wet asphalt. The city was changing. He could feel it in the suspension of his car. Potholes were ignored. New condos of glass and steel rose like jagged teeth from the gums of old brick neighborhoods, and the people walking the sidewalks seemed younger, faster, glued to the blue light of their phones. He was a relic here, an analog device in a digital world, trying to solve a crime that the city had long ago digested and forgotten. His apartment was on the second floor of a walk-up in a neighborhood that was, quote, 270,
which was real estate code for expensive coffee shops opening next to boarded-up laundromats. He climbed the stairs, the banister sticky under his palm. Inside, the air was stale. He lived the life of a man who spent 18 hours a day elsewhere. There was a cat, a ragged stray he'd started feeding 2 years ago, that had eventually just walked in and decided to stay, named Barnaby. Barnaby was asleep on the back of the beige sofa. He didn't wake up when Miller tossed his keys into the bowl. Miller loosened his tie, poured 3 fingers of rye into a tumbler that he didn't bother to check for dust, and sat at his dining table.
The table wasn't for eating. It was the spillover for his mind. Stacks of manila folders, copies of coroner's reports, and topographical maps of the ravine where she was found covered the wood veneer. He pushed a stack of utility bills aside and opened his laptop. It was an older model, heavy as a brick, the fan whining as it struggled to boot up. He logged into his personal email. There was nothing new. He hadn't expected anything. Thorne had said it would take time, but the itch was there, under his skin. JD, who were you? A tech-savvy teenager who got a DNA kit for Christmas? An elderly man looking for his birth parents? A bored housewife in the Midwest? Miller took a sip of the rye. It burned, a familiar grounding heat. He pulled a notepad toward him. He wrote JD at the top of the page. Then he wrote 4th cousin. Then he began to draw a tree, starting from the bottom and working up, sketching out the impossible mathematics of the past. 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-greats. By the time you reached the generation Thorne was talking about, you were looking at 32 ancestors, 32 lives, 32 stories of love, loss, migration, war, and famine. And somewhere in that tangled root system, one of those 32 people had produced a line that led to JD, and another line that led to a girl wrapped in a blue tarp, dumped in a ravine in 1998. Miller stared at the branching lines until they blurred. He wasn't just looking for a killer anymore. He was looking for a family. He was looking for the precise moment a family tree had split, sending one branch into the light of the future and the other into the darkness of an unmarked grave. Friday came with the inevitability of a sentencing hearing. The break room smelled of cheap coffee and sugar. There were balloons, blue and silver, taped to the back of a chair. A sheet cake from the grocery store sat in the center of the table, the icing spelling out, "Good luck, Detective Miller," in a shaky cursive that suggested the decorator had been in a rush. The captain, a man 10 years Miller's junior, who spoke in buzzwords and worried more about budget variance than clearance rates, tapped a plastic spoon against a diet soda can. The room filled with detectives, uniformed officers, and a few administrative clerks. They held paper plates like shields. Miller stood near the coffee pot, his hands clasped behind his back, wearing his best suit, the navy one he usually reserved for court testimony. The captain began, launching into a speech Miller knew he had downloaded from a management seminar. He talked about dedication, about the long blue line, about the sacrifices made. Miller tuned him out. He scanned the faces in the room. He saw impatience in the younger ones. They wanted cake. They wanted to get back to their active cases. They wanted the old dinosaur to leave so they could have his desk, which had the best view of the alleyway. He saw Thorne standing in the back. She wasn't clapping. She was holding a thick, sealed envelope. Her eyes met his, and she gave a microscopic nod. And so, the captain concluded, handing Miller a plaque that felt suspiciously like plastic, pretending to be wood. "We wish Robert the very best in his retirement. Don't be a stranger, Bob." "I won't," Miller lied. There was applause. It was polite, rhythmic, and short. Then came the cake cutting, the awkward handshakes, the "what will you do with all your free time" questions that he answered with non-committal grunts about fishing or fixing up the apartment. 20 minutes later it was over. The room cleared. Miller walked back to his desk for the final time. He had already packed the personal items: a framed photo of his late wife Helen, a ceramic mug, a stress ball he never used. Thorne was waiting by his desk. "You survived," she said. "Barely." She held out the envelope. "This isn't official police business. This is a hobbyist sharing genealogical research with a friend." Miller took the envelope. It was heavy. "What's in here?" "I stayed up the last 2 nights," Thorne said, her voice dropping. "I built the mirror trees. I took the top 5 matches, including JD, and I started building their trees back to 1850. I'm looking for the intersection." "Did you find it?"
"Not yet. It's a mess, Robert. Endogamy. People marrying cousins, distant relatives marrying back into the same lines. It happens in small communities. It tangles the DNA, makes the algorithms confused." "So we're blind?" "Not blind, just needing glasses. I printed out everything I have. Census records, obituaries, draft cards. It's a puzzle with 1,000 pieces and no picture on the box." Miller tucked the envelope under his arm. "I have time. Starting tomorrow, I have nothing but time." "Robert," Thorne said, touching his sleeve, "don't let this eat you. You're out. You made it." "She didn't make it," Miller said softly. Thorne withdrew her hand. "I'll keep monitoring the database. If a closer match comes in, a second cousin, a first cousin, I'll know instantly. But until then, you're going to be reading a lot of handwriting from the 19th century." "I like the 19th century," Miller said. "Things were slower." He walked out of the station without looking back. He turned in his badge and his service weapon at the armory cage. The holster left a phantom weight on his hip, a lightness that made him feel off balance, as if he might float away into the grey afternoon sky. Monday morning, 6 a.m. Miller's eyes snapped open. The alarm hadn't gone off because he hadn't set it. The silence of the apartment was absolute. No traffic report on the radio, no rush to shower, no court dates, no roll call. He lay there for 10 minutes, listening to the refrigerator hum, feeling the panic of purposelessness rise in his chest. Then he remembered the envelope. He got up, made a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint, and cleared the dining room table. He pushed the maps of the ravine aside and dumped the contents of Thorne's envelope. Paper cascaded out, charts, spreadsheets, photocopies of old cursive documents. Thorne was thorough. She was brilliant. She had color-coded the family lines. Miller picked up the first sheet. Match number 1, J.D., 45 centimorgans. Thorne had managed to trace J.D.'s line back to a couple in rural Pennsylvania, Elias and Martha Varkas, born in the 1840s. Miller pinned the sheet to the wall. He grabbed a fresh notebook. He felt a flicker of the old instinct, the hunter's focus. He wasn't a cop anymore, but the logic of the hunt didn't require a badge. It required patience. He spent the morning learning the language of the dead. He learned that census takers in 1910 often couldn't spell. He learned that people changed their names to sound less foreign or more elegant. He learned that families exploded outward like shrapnel, one son moving to Ohio, another to California, a daughter dying of scarlet fever at 6. By noon his eyes burned. He had traced the Varkas line down 3 generations. Elias and Martha had 7 children. Those 7 children had produced 32 grandchildren. He was looking for a convergence. He needed to find where the Varkas line intersected with the lines of the other DNA matches. If match A and match B were both related to the Jane Doe, and match A and match B also shared a common ancestor with each other, that common ancestor was the key. He ate a sandwich standing over the table, crumbs falling onto a photocopy of a 1930 draft card. Tuesday passed, then Wednesday. He barely left the apartment. He stopped shaving. He started talking to Barnaby, explaining the intricacies of pedigree collapse. He muttered, pointing a pen at the wall, which was now covered in papers connected by red yarn he'd bought at a craft store. Barnaby blinked and licked a paw. On Thursday the phone rang. It was Thorne. She asked. Miller said. She said, sounding impressed. Miller scanned his wall. He scrambled through the piles on the table. Thorne's voice spiked with excitement. Miller said, his heart hammering a heavy rhythm against his ribs. Thorne instructed. Miller hung up. He felt alive. The lethargy of the last few months, the feeling of being a rusted cog, vanished. He tore down the irrelevant branches from the wall. He was pruning the tree. He spent the next 3 days living with the Callaways.
He found them in census records. He found them in newspaper archives online, paying the subscription fees with his own credit card. He read about their weddings, their car accidents, their prize-winning pumpkins at county fairs. He found a patriarch, Samuel Calloway, born 1910. He moved from West Virginia to Detroit in 1942 for the auto plants. Samuel had 4 sons. Miller traced the sons. Son number 1 died in Korea, no issue. Son number 2 stayed in Detroit. 3 daughters, all accounted for and living. Son number 3 moved to Chicago. 2 sons. Son number 4, drifter. Arrest record for petty theft. Last known address in 1975, Toledo, Ohio. Miller focused on son number 4, Arthur Calloway. If Arthur had a child, a daughter born in the late 70s, she would be the right age to be the Jane Doe found in 1998. But Arthur was a ghost. No marriage record, no obituary, just a few scuffs with the law, and then silence. Miller sat back, rubbing his temples. The digital trail had run cold. The internet could only tell you what had been recorded. Arthur Calloway was the type of man who lived in the margins, between the lines of the census ledgers. Miller looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. He had been retired for 10 days. He stood up and walked to the window. The streetlights below hummed. He needed to go to Toledo. The drive took 2 hours. Miller took his personal car, the grey sedan. He didn't have a badge to flash, so he brought a box of donuts and his most harmless, confused old man expression. He started at the Toledo Public Library, scrolling through microfiche of city directories from the mid-70s. He found Arthur Calloway listed in 1974, 1422 Elm Street, occupation, labourer. In 1975, the listing changed. Calloway, Arthur and Marie. Marie? A wife? A girlfriend? In 1976, they were gone. Miller wrote down the address. He drove to Elm Street. It was a neighbourhood of small, siding-clad bungalows that had seen better decades. 1422 was peeling yellow paint, the porch sagging. Miller parked and sat in the car. What was he doing? He couldn't knock on the door and demand answers. He was a civilian. He got out anyway. He walked up the cracked path. A tricycle lay overturned in the grass. He knocked. A young woman opened the door, holding a baby on her hip. She looked exhausted. Miller said, pitching his voice to a gentle rumble. The woman blinked. Miller said. Miller looked past her, into the hallway. It was just a house. She said, shifting the baby. Miller's pulse skipped. She scrutinized him. He looked like exactly what he was, a tired old man in a cheap suit, harmless. Quote 325, she said. Quote 326. She disappeared and returned a moment later, dragging a cardboard box that smelled of mildew and gasoline. She kicked it onto the porch. Quote 327, she said. Quote 328. Quote 329, Miller said. Quote 330. He carried the box to his trunk like it was filled with gold bullion. He drove 2 blocks away, parked in a Rite Aid lot, and opened it. Old magazines, rusted spark plugs, a broken toaster, and at the bottom a stack of envelopes bound with a rotting rubber band. The rubber band snapped as he touched it. He picked up the top envelope. It was a bill from the electric company, dated August 1975, addressed to Arthur Calloway. Beneath that, a letter, handwritten, no envelope. Dear Artie, I can't do this anymore. You drink too much and you scare the little one. I'm taking Sarah and going to my sister's in Cleveland. Don't try to find us. Marie. Miller stared at the paper. The ink was faded, blue ballpoint on lined notebook paper. Sarah. He picked up his phone. His hands were shaking, just a little. He dialed Thorne. Quote 331, he said when she answered. Quote 332. Quote 333. There was a silence on the line. Then, Thorne's voice, sharp and professional. Quote 334. Quote 335, Miller said. Quote 336. Quote 336. Quote 336. Quote 335. Quote 336. Quote 343. Quote 336. Quote 335. Thorne repeated, the sound of her typing clattering in the background. Quote 338. 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 Thorne repeated, the sound of her typing Miller exhaled. Thorne repeated, 339. Miller exhaled. 339. Never then go one. Never then go one. Never then go one. Chapter 309. Chapter 309. Chapter 309. Never then go one. Chapter 309. Never then go one. Chapter 309. Chapter 309. Quote 339. Topic the thorn self, which was for to the neither long. Chapter 309. 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 Stared at the paper. The ink was faded, blue ballpoint on lined notebook paper. Quote 338. Quote 300 exhaled. Quote 340. Quote 341. Thorne said. Quote 342. Quote 343. Quote 344. The typing stopped. Quote 345. Quote 346. Quote 347. Thorne said quietly. Quote 348. Quote 349. Miller said. Quote 350. Thorne said. Quote 351. Quote 352. Quote 353. A pause. Quote 354. Quote 355. Quote 356. Quote 357. Miller said, starting the car.
Thorne said.
Miller said. He hung up. He looked at the passenger seat where the box of trash sat. He looked at the letter again. You scare the little one. He pulled out of the parking lot. The sun was beginning to set again, turning the sky a bruised purple. He wasn't tired. He wasn't retired. He was the only person in the world who knew Sarah Jean Calloway's name, and he wasn't going to let it be forgotten again. The road to Sandusky was flat and straight, cutting through fields of darkening corn. Miller drove with the radio off. He rehearsed what he would say. He pictured the old man. He pictured the Jane Doe. He stripped away the blue tarp, the cold mud, the anonymity. He put a face on her. He gave her the name Sarah. Sarah, he thought, I'm coming. The miles ticked by, bringing him closer to the man who might be a monster, or might just be a broken father who lost track of a fleeing family. Miller didn't know which it was. But he knew that for the first time in 20 years, the silence of the cold case was about to be broken. He pressed the accelerator. The grey sedan surged forward, cutting a path through the gathering night. Robert Miller pushed open the heavy steel door of the Lakeview Care Center, the smell of antiseptic and boiled cabbage hitting him instantly. He didn't stop at the front desk. He walked with a singular, rhythmic purpose down the B-wing corridor, counting the room numbers. Even at 7 p.m., the fluorescent lights hummed with an aggressive brightness. Room 114. The door was open a crack. Miller pushed it inward. The room was small, dominated by a single bed and a television playing a game show on mute. Arthur Calloway sat in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at the parking lot where Miller had just parked. The man was small, shrunken by age, his skin the texture of parchment paper. Miller asked. The old man didn't turn. "Nurse?" "No, sir. My name is Robert Miller. I'm an investigator." Arthur turned his head slowly. His eyes were milky, clouded by cataracts, but there was a flicker of awareness. "Police?" "Something like that," Miller said. He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him to muffle the hallway chatter. "I'm looking for Sarah." The reaction was immediate. Arthur's hands, resting on the armrests of the wheelchair, tightened. The loose skin over his knuckles went white. "Sarah's gone. Gone to California. Years ago." "I know," Miller lied softly. He pulled the plastic guest chair close to the wheelchair and sat down, bringing himself to Arthur's eye level. Arthur whispered. He reached for a styrofoam cup of water on his bedside table. His hand shook. He took a sip, the sound of swallowing loud in the quiet room. Miller watched the cup. That white styrofoam was the Holy Grail, Arthur said. He set the cup down. Miller watched the man's face. He looked for the monster Thorne had warned him about. He looked for the guilt of a murderer. He saw only a fragile, decaying regret. If Arthur Calloway had killed his daughter and buried her in a riverside field, the memory of it was buried under layers of dementia and time. Miller said. Miller reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a clean, sealed evidence bag. 383. Arthur looked at the cup, then at Miller. He didn't ask about warrants. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He just nodded, looking tired. Miller picked up the cup by the rim, careful not to touch the area where Arthur's lips had been. He placed it inside the bag and sealed it. Miller said. He stood up. Arthur said, turning back to the window. Miller froze. His hand went to the doorknob. The Jane Doe had been found with scraps of blue fabric. It was a specific detail, one never released to the press. The adrenaline spiked in Miller's chest, a cold flush. Miller said. He walked out of the room, the bag heavy in his pocket. He marched past the nurse's station, out the double doors, and into the cool night air. He sat in his car, his heart hammering against his ribs. He dialed Thorne. I have the DNA, he said. And Thorne? He mentioned a blue dress. The wait took 6 weeks. In the world of 1980s policing, 6 weeks was an eternity. In 2019, it was a blink of an eye. Yet it felt agonizingly slow to Miller. He spent the time organizing the file, preparing for the confession he was sure would come once the science proved the link. He drafted the affidavit. He imagined the headline. Father arrested in 35-year-old cold case. He was sitting at his desk, staring at the Riverside Ledger clippings, when the phone rang. It was Sarah Thorne. Robert? Her voice was flat. Tell me, Miller said. It's not a match. The silence on the line stretched out, filling the room. Miller closed his eyes. What? I ran the STR profile against the Jane Doe, Thorne said, her voice clinical, masking her own disappointment. Arthur Calloway is not the father of our Jane Doe. There is zero biological relationship. The exclusion is absolute. But the dress, Miller said, gripping the phone. He admitted to tearing a blue dress. Coincidence, Thorne said gently, or memory conflation. Blue dresses were common in 1984, Robert. Arguments about clothing were common. It fits the narrative in your head, but it doesn't fit the biology. Our victim is not Sarah Jean Calloway. Miller exhaled, a long, deflating sound. So we have nothing. We have a negative result, Thorne corrected. That's not nothing. It means we stop looking at the Calloways. It means we stop wasting time on a false lead. The Nevada report? I checked that too while the DNA was processing. The dental records for the missing girl in Reno came back. She was found alive in Oregon in 1990. She just never told her parents. Miller looked at the box of files. The Calloway tab was the thickest one. He reached out and peeled the label off, crumbling it into a ball. Robert, Thorne said, her voice changing. It became sharper, more focused. There is something else, something new. I'm listening.
You've heard about the Golden State Killer arrest? Everyone has. They caught D'Angelo.
Do you know how they caught him? Thorne asked. They didn't use CODIS. They didn't use the police database. They used forensic genetic genealogy. Miller rubbed his temples. Ancestry websites? For a murder case? It's more complex than that, but essentially yes. They took the killer's DNA and uploaded it to a public database called GED Match. They didn't look for the killer, they looked for his third cousins. They built a family tree backward until it pointed to one man. Can we do that? Technically, yes, Thorne said. Ethically? It's a grey area, but the guidelines are shifting rapidly. The Department of Justice is issuing interim policies. If we want to do this, we need to do it now, before the window closes or the rules tighten. But there is a risk. What risk?
The sample from the femur, Thorne said. It's degraded. We have very little left. To run the SNP array, the type of high-density DNA sequencing required for genealogy, we need to consume almost all of the remaining bone powder. If this fails, Robert, there is no second chance. We will have destroyed the evidence. Miller looked at the artist's sketch of Jane Doe 1984. The generic eyes, the approximated nose. She had been waiting in a drawer for 35 years. She had no name. She had no visitors. Miller said, the process of forensic genetic genealogy was not dramatic. It was quiet, tedious, and mathematical. It took place not in interrogation rooms, but in server farms and on computer screens. Thorne coordinated the transfer of the remaining bone powder to a specialized lab in Virginia. There, technicians performed a, quote, 426, quote. They weren't looking for the standard 20 markers used in police work. They were looking at hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs. These were the tiny variations in the genetic code that made a person unique, the specific spelling errors in the book of life that were passed down through generations. The sequencing took 2 months. The data file that came back was massive. Thorne took the raw data and converted it into a format compatible with GED Match. She sat in her home office, the glow of the monitors illuminating her face. It was 2 a.m. She clicked the Upload button. A progress bar crawled across the screen. Processing. Comparing against 1.2 million kits. She sipped her tea, waiting. This was the modern séance. She was asking the data to speak for the dead. The screen refreshed. A list of names appeared. Thorne scanned the total CM column, centimorgans, the unit of measurement for genetic linkage. At the top of the list, there were no parents, no siblings, no first cousins.
The highest match was a user named L. Vance. Shared CM 124. Thorne pulled up her reference chart. 124 centimorgans usually indicated a third cousin, or perhaps a second cousin once removed.
It wasn't a close match. It meant they shared a set of great-great-grandparents.
Thorne whispered to the empty room. She opened a new browser tab and logged into Ancestry.com. She typed in, quote, 432, quote. She filtered by location. She cross-referenced with the email address provided in GEDmatch. She found a Lucinda Vance in Columbus, Ohio. Lucinda had a public family tree. Thorne opened it. It was a sprawling web of names and dates, going back to the 1800s. Thorne began the work. She started with Lucinda and moved backward in time. Parents: Mark Vance and Susan Greer. Grandparents: Thomas Vance and Mary O'Connell. Great-grandparents: Silas Vance and Eleanor Rigby. Silas and Eleanor were the common ancestors. They lived in rural Ohio in the 1920s. They had 6 children. Thorne created a, quote, 433. She built the family lines forward from Silas and Eleanor, tracing every single descendant of those 6 children. It was a geometric expansion of humanity. 6 children became 20 grandchildren. 20 grandchildren became 50 great-grandchildren. She had to find the one female great-grandchild who was born around 1960, who disappeared in 1984, and who was never reported missing. She worked through the night. She used obituaries to find names of survivors. She used high school yearbooks digitized online to verify ages. She used Facebook to check for, quote, 434 status. Branch 1, the Millers, all accounted for. Branch 2, the Kowalskis. One daughter died in 1999 of cancer, not a match. Branch 3, the Vances. Thorne focused on the third son of Silas Vance, a man named Harold Vance. Harold had moved to Indiana for work in the auto industry. He had 2 sons, David and Michael. Michael Vance stayed in Indiana. David Vance moved to Riverside County in the late 70s for a construction boom, then returned to Ohio. Thorne dug into David Vance. He died in a car accident in 1995. His obituary listed his survivors. Survived by his wife Judith and his son Paul. There was no mention of a daughter. Thorne frowned. If David was the father, the victim would be a first cousin to the match, not a third. The math didn't work. She moved up a generation. She went back to Harold's brother, George Vance. George lived his whole life in a small town outside Dayton. He had a daughter named Margaret and a son named Frank. Frank Vance. Born 1938. Frank married a woman named Elena Corvus in 1958. They had 3 children. 1. Frank Jr., born 1959. 2. Elena Marie, born 1961. 3. Thomas, born 1965. Thorne stared at the second name. Elena Marie Vance. She opened a new tab. She searched for Elena Marie Vance. Census records. Present in 1970. Present in 1980. 1970. 1980. Public Records Index. An address in Dayton, Ohio in 1983. Then silence. No marriage record. No death record. No credit history after 1984. No digital footprint. Thorne looked at the brothers. Frank Jr. was active on LinkedIn. Thomas was on Facebook, posting photos of his grandkids. But Elena was a ghost. Thorne picked up the phone. It was 6 a.m. She called Miller. "I have a name," she said. "Elena Vance." Miller sat in the passenger seat of his own car. A younger detective, Mendez, was driving. Miller's vision wasn't what it used to be for long highway drives, and Thorne insisted he take backup. They were crossing the state line into Ohio. Mendez asked. Miller said, looking out at the flat, grey landscape. They arrived in Dayton just after lunch. The address Thorne had provided was for Thomas Vance, the younger brother. It was a modest ranch house with a manicured lawn and a flag flying on the porch. Miller got out. He adjusted his tie. He felt the weight of the badge on his belt, heavy and familiar. This was the part of the job he hated, and the part he loved. The breaking of the news and the solving of the puzzle. He rang the doorbell. A man in his 50s answered. He wore a polo shirt and glasses. He looked like a man who had lived a quiet, decent life. Thomas frowned. He was the first. It is water, the folks of the 4. He found it a 4 for first. I were taking about for the 4 for the first we go. So it was no for the 4 for the first. He found the 4 for the first of 4 for the fluke. He thought the form of the fluke was amazing the fluke. He found the world full of fluke. The first of the world he was inquired from the fluke. For the first. For the first of the fluke. The first of the fluke. For the first. For the first. The first of the fluke, he was empoisoned of the fluke. The first. The colour drained from Thomas. He stepped back, holding the doorframe. For the first. The first of the fluke. For the first of the fluke. For the first. 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 For the first of the fluke. For the first of the fluke. For the first. For the first. The 1 minute. They fill the first of the fluke. For the first. 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 Now that they sat in the living room, it was cluttered with family photos. Miller scanned them quickly. He saw wedding photos, graduation photos. And there, on the mantel, tucked behind a trophy, was a small framed picture of a young woman with dark hair and a bright, defiant smile. She was wearing a blue dress. Miller's heart stopped for a second. The dress wasn't torn, it was pristine. But the color, it was the exact shade of the scrap found in the mud 30 years ago. "We haven't heard from Elena since 1984, Thomas said, his voice trembling. "She left. She said she was going to Hollywood. She wanted to be a makeup artist. She had big dreams." "Did she call?" Miller asked gently.
For the first few months, postcards. Then, nothing. My parents tried to file a report, but the police there, they said she was an adult. They said people go to California to get lost. They said she probably just didn't want to be found. Thomas looked at his hands. Mom died thinking Elena hated us. Miller reached into his folder. He didn't pull out the crime scene photos. Those were too harsh. He pulled out the artist's rendering, the one with the soft lines. "Mr. Vance," Miller said, "we found a young woman in 1984. We didn't know who she was. We've been trying to identify her for 3 decades. Thomas looked at the sketch. He let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He reached out and touched the paper. "That's her nose," he whispered. "That's L." "We need to be sure," Miller said softly. "The genealogy points to your family, but to confirm it legally, to give her name back, I need a DNA sample from you. Just a cheek swab." Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Anything. Do it." Miller put on his gloves. He took out the sterile swab. As he collected the sample, he felt a profound sense of shifting gravity. The Jane Doe file, which had sat on his desk like a stone for 20 years, was dissolving. "What happened to her?" Thomas asked, after Miller had sealed the tube. "We're investigating that," Miller said. "But we found her. She wasn't lost, Thomas. She was just waiting." The confirmation came 48 hours later. Miller was in the station. Captain Henderson was there. Sarah Thorne was on speakerphone. "The sample from Thomas Vance shares 2,800 centimorgans with the victim," Thorne said. "It is a full sibling match. The probability of identity is 99.9999%. Miller nodded. He didn't cheer. He felt a deep, resonant exhaustion. Henderson said, signing the form. Miller took the file. He walked out of the office down the hall to the records room. It was quiet. The dust motes danced in the light of the setting sun. He found the box. Case number 84-9022, unidentified female. He took a black marker from his pocket. He didn't cross out the label. He peeled it off carefully. He took a new label. He wrote in block letters. He stuck the label on the box. He then walked to the large corkboard that dominated the back wall of the precinct. The cold case board. The sketch of the girl had been there since Miller was a rookie. It was yellowed, curling at the edges. Miller took the pushpin out. He took the sketch down. He replaced it with a copy of the photo Thomas Vance had given him. The photo of Elena smiling, alive, full of hope. Beneath it, he pinned a typed index card. Name, Elena Vance. Born, Dayton, Ohio, 1961. Identified, 2019. He stood back. "Hello, Elena," he said softly. He checked his watch. It was 5 p.m. His shift was over. His career was almost over. But the work wasn't done. Giving her a name was just the beginning. Now that they knew who she was, they could find out who killed her. He walked out to his car. He drove to the offices of the Riverside Ledger. The building was mostly empty now, the print industry dying a slow death much like the old investigation methods. But the archives were there. He met the editor, a young woman named Sarah, ironically enough. Miller said. She led him to the computer terminal, the digital archives. She typed in the date. The headline from November 1984 popped up. Body of unidentified woman found in field. She asked, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Miller placed the press release on the desk. Miller said. As the editor typed, the pixels on the screen shifted. The old headline remained as a historical record, but the tag,
the searchable index, the digital soul of the article changed. Updated. Victim identified as Elena Vance. Miller watched the cursor blink. The Riverside Ledger was finally updated with the name Elena Vance. It was a small change, a few bytes of data on a server somewhere in a basement, but to Miller, it felt like a tectonic shift. The cursor pulsed, on, off, a heartbeat for a ghost who had finally been invited back into the world of the living. Miller said, his voice scratching against the silence of the newsroom. She asked, looking up at him. Her face was bathed in the blue glow of the monitor, young, unlined, untouched by the kind of decades-long erosion that had carved the canyons into Miller's own features. Miller said. He adjusted the brim of his hat, a reflex from a time when men wore hats for reasons other than hiding thinning hair. He walked away from the glow of the terminal, navigating the maze of empty cubicles. The newsroom smelled of stale coffee and ozone, a sterile scent that had replaced the heavy, industrial perfume of ink and hot lead he remembered from the 80s. Back then, this room would have been a chaotic symphony of shouting editors, clacking typewriters, and ringing phones. Now, it was a tomb for information. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the riverside evening. The air had turned sharply cold, the kind of damp chill that seeped through his coat and settled directly into the marrow of his bad knee. The streetlights were flickering on, casting long, jaundiced shadows across the wet pavement. Miller walked to his car, an unmarked sedan that had seen better days, much like its driver. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, not turning the key. He just gripped the steering wheel, feeling the texture of the worn leather. Elena Vance. He said it again in his mind, testing the weight of it. For 35 years, she had been a number, a collection of biological markers, a height, a weight, a dental record. Jane Doe, 84-9022. The designation had been a shield, a way to keep the horror of her end at arm's length. You could investigate a Jane Doe with clinical detachment. You could look at the autopsy photos of a Jane Doe and tell yourself it was just puzzle-solving. But Elena Vance? Elena Vance had a mother who had probably waited by a window for years. Elena Vance had a favorite color, a song she hummed while doing laundry, a fear of spiders, a dream of becoming something more than a body found in a field. The name stripped away the shield. It made the violence personal. He started the engine. The car rumbled to life, a low growl that vibrated through the seat. He pulled out into traffic, the red taillights of the cars ahead blurring into a river of blood in the mist. He wasn't going home. Not yet. His apartment was too quiet, filled with the silence of a life narrowed down to the job. Instead, he drove toward the precinct. But he didn't park in the lot. He circled the block and parked near the old rail yards, the place where the city began to fray at the edges. This wasn't where she was found. That was miles north, in what was now a strip mall, but had been a sorghum field in '84. But it was where the investigation had stalled. The Greyhound station was 3 blocks from here. If she had come from Dayton, she would have stepped off the bus there. Miller killed the engine and reached for the glove box. He pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. He'd quit 10 years ago, on doctor's orders, but he kept a pack for the nights when the ghosts were loud. He didn't light one. He just held it, rolling the cylinder of tobacco between his fingers, smelling the dried leaves. He closed his eyes and tried to summon 1984. He remembered the texture of that year, the fear of the bomb still humming in the background, the music, synthesizers and big hair, the feeling that the world was speeding up. He had been 30 years old, young, hungry. He had arrived at the crime scene in a cheap suit, thinking he was going to save the world. He remembered the mud on his shoes. He remembered the coroner, Doc Holloway, shaking his head as he looked down at the girl. Miller opened his eyes. He reached into the passenger seat and grabbed the copy of the case file he brought with him. He clicked on the overhead map light. He flipped past the gruesome crime scene photos, past the initial reports, to the property inventory. Item 4. 1 bus ticket stub, Dayton to Riverside. Date, November 2nd, 1984. Item 5. 3/4. 1 nickel found in pocket. Item 6. A folded piece of paper, water-damaged, illegible. That piece of paper. It had tormented him for 3 decades. Lab tech after lab tech had tried to raise the ink. They had used every spectrum of light, every chemical wash. Nothing. The water and the mud had taken the words. But now they had context. Miller pulled out his phone. It was a modern smartphone, a device he loathed but tolerated. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he had added only an hour ago. Thomas Vance. He hesitated. It was past 6 p.m. In Ohio, it was the same time. Dinner time. Family time. He pressed the call button. The ringback tone purred 3 times. The voice was jagged, tired. Thomas had been crying. Miller could hear the congestion in the vowels. Quote, 486. A silence on the line, heavy and thick. Miller said softly. He heard a ragged exhale on the other end. 499, Miller said, shifting gears, his formula within southern classed. Although the round was helling the enders without for a moment. He willed Beckham to those. I think this is a prefix but 4. Without for a moment. I fought it themselves without for a moment. Without for a moment. He swiss, Miller said, shifting gears, his formula within southern classed. Although the rad was helling the enders without for a moment. He whirred back unto those. He whirred back unto those. Without for a moment. Without for a moment. He said. 494. Miller's grip on the phone tightened. Miller asked, grabbing a pen from his pocket and flipping the file folder over to write on the back. Thomas said, a flash of old anger surfacing. Miller muttered. Thomas said, his voice breaking. Miller stared out the windshield at the darkening rail yard. He whispered. He had come to those, Thomas asked, hope rising in his voice, as if her agency in her final moments mattered. Miller said. Thomas said. Miller wrote it down, underlining it twice. Rick Rich, musician, blue Ford Econoline, snake tattoo, 1984. Miller said. Miller hung up. He sat in the darkness for a long time. The rain had started to fall, drumming a rhythmic beat on the roof of the car. He had a lead, a cold, 35-year-old lead, but it was more than he'd had at 4:59 p.m. He started the car and put it in gear. He wasn't going home. He was going back to the station. The archives room in the basement held the dusty arrest logs from the 80s. If a guy named Rick with a snake tattoo and a bad temper had been passing through Riverside in a broken-down van, maybe he'd gotten into a bar fight. Maybe he'd been pulled over for a busted taillight. Maybe he'd been arrested for vagrancy. Miller drove through the rain-slicked streets, the wipers counting time. Rick, Rick, Rick. When he walked back into the precinct, the night shift sergeant, a burly man named Kowalski, looked up from his sandwich. Forget your keys, Miller. You're supposed to be retired in 2 weeks. Go home. Miller walked past the desk, heading for the stairs to the basement. Not tonight, Kowalski. I'm going into the dungeon. Suit yourself. Watch out for the rats. The basement records room was cooler than the rest of the station. It smelled of mildew and decaying paper. The fluorescent lights flickered on with a reluctant buzz, illuminating rows of metal shelves stacked floor to ceiling with bankers' boxes. Miller walked to the section marked 1984, Arrests, Bookings. He pulled down the first box labelled January to March. He set it on the floor. He pulled down October to December. He sat on the concrete floor, his bad knee protesting, and opened the box. The files were brittle, mugshots stapled to carbon copies. Faces of men and women, long dead or long incarcerated, stared back at him. Drunks, thieves, brawlers, hookers, the cast of the city's underbelly. He started leafing through November. November 1st, DUI. November 2nd, assault. November 2nd, disorderly conduct. He scanned the names. He scanned the physical descriptions. He paused at a file from November 3rd, 1984, the day after Elena Vance arrived in Riverside, the day before her body was found. Suspect, Richard J. Sallow, D.O.B., April 12, 1958. Charge: public intoxication, resisting arrest. Location: the Blue Room Bar, 4th Street. Miller's finger traced the lines. He flipped the page to the physical description. Height: 5 feet 11 inches. Weight: 175 pounds. Hair: black, long. Distinguishing marks: tattoo, right side of neck, cobra. Miller felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement temperature. He stared at the mugshot. Richard Sallow. He had high cheekbones, greasy hair hanging in his face, and eyes that looked like black holes. He was sneering at the camera. "Gotcha," Miller whispered. He read further. Sallow had been held for 24 hours to sleep it off. He was released on November 4th. Elena was found on November 5th. Her estimated time of death was the night of the 4th or early morning of the 5th. Sallow was in town. He was angry. He was drinking. And he was released just in time to find the girl who had run away from him. Miller took a picture of the file with his phone, ensuring the flash didn't glare on the glossy mugshot. Then he carefully removed the file from the box. This wasn't just a drunk tank record anymore. This was Exhibit A. He stood up, his joints popping, and dusted off his trousers. He climbed the stairs back to the main floor, his fatigue replaced by a predatory focus. He went to his desk and sat down at his computer. He logged into the NCIC database. He had a name. Now he needed a current address. Richard J. Sallow. He typed it in. The cursor blinked. Searching. Miller held his breath. If Sallow was dead, this was going to be a short investigation. If he was in prison, it would be easy. If he was in the wind... The screen populated. Status: incarcerated. Facility: Corcoran State Prison, California. Offense: aggravated assault, attempted murder, 1992. Parole eligibility: denied 2018. Next hearing 2021. Miller let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding since the Reagan administration. He was alive. He was in a cage. And he was in California, the very place he'd promised to take Elena. Miller grabbed the phone on his desk. He dialed the number for the warden's office at Corcoran. It was late, probably too late for administration, as California was 3 hours behind. It was only 4 p.m. there. Corcoran State Prison, warden's office. "This is Detective Frank Miller, Riverside Police Department, Homicide Division," Miller said, his voice dropping into the authoritative baritone he saved for the brass. "I need to speak to the warden regarding an inmate." Richard Sallow. "Regarding what matter, Detective?" "Regarding a cold case homicide from 1984, Miller said. "And tell him not to let Sallow know I'm calling. I don't want him lawyering up before I get there." "Before you get there?" the secretary asked. "Yeah," Miller said, looking at the photo of Elena Vance he had pinned to the corkboard. The girl who wanted to be a photographer. The girl who trusted the wrong man. "I'm coming to see him." "Going home now?" "Going to pack?" "I'm going to California." The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and shining under the streetlights. Miller drove home, his mind racing. He rehearsed the interrogation. He knew men like Sallow, narcissists, bullies. They thrived on fear, but they crumbled when you took away their power. Sallow had been rotting in a cell for nearly 30 years. He probably thought the world had forgotten his sins from '84. He probably thought he had gotten away with the one that really mattered. Miller parked in front of his apartment building, a brick monolith from the 20s that smelled of boiled cabbage and floor wax. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his door. Inside, his apartment was sparse. A leather armchair, a television he rarely watched, a bookshelf filled with true crime procedurals and history books. He went to the bedroom and pulled a duffel bag from the closet. He packed methodically, 3 shirts, underwear, socks, his shaving kit. He threw in a portable tape recorder and a fresh stack of batteries. He hesitated, then reached into the back of his sock drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it. Inside was a silver locket. It had belonged to his wife, Mary. She had died of cancer 5 years ago. She had always told him he worked too hard.
that he cared too much about the dead and not enough about the living. "One more, Mary," he whispered to the empty room. "Just one more, and then I'm done. I promise." "Hang on, kid. I'm coming." He turned off the light. The apartment plunged into darkness, save for the red glow of the digital clock. 8:15 p.m. He lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep usually evaded him when a case broke, his mind churning with variables and timelines. But tonight, a strange calm settled over him. It wasn't the satisfaction of a closed case, far from it. It was the clarity of purpose. For the first time in 35 years, he wasn't chasing a ghost, he was hunting a man. And Frank Miller was very, very good at hunting men. The alarm was set for 4 a.m. The flight to Fresno was at 6:30. From there, a rental car to Corcoran. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, the image of the dead girl in the field was replaced by the photo Thomas Vance had sent. Elena, smiling, alive, standing in front of a Christmas tree, looking at a future that Richard Sallow had stolen. Miller's breathing slowed. He drifted into a shallow sleep, dreaming of California's sun and the cold, grey walls of a prison where a reckoning was waiting to happen. The flight was cramped and smelled of recycled air and stale peanuts. Miller sat in the aisle seat, his long legs jammed against the seat in front of him. He spent the 4 hours reading the files on Richard Sallow that he had pulled from the national database before leaving the precinct. Sallow's life was a roadmap of destruction. Petty theft in Ohio, assault in Kentucky, drug possession in Nevada, and then the big one in California, attacking a girlfriend with a tire iron. She had survived, barely. She had testified. That put him away. But there was a gap. November 1984 to 1986. No arrests, no paper trail. Sallow had gone to ground after Riverside. He knew what he had done. He had been careful. Miller landed in Fresno just before noon. The heat hit him the moment he stepped out of the terminal, a dry, dusty heat that sucked the moisture right out of his skin. It was a stark contrast to the damp gloom of Riverside. He picked up a nondescript rental car, a white Chevy Malibu, and hit Highway 99 south. The landscape was flat and brown, miles of agriculture and dust. It was hard country, unforgiving. He reached Corcoran State Prison an hour later. It rose out of the fields like a fortress, concrete towers and razor wire shimmering in the heat haze. This was where the state of California kept its monsters. Charles Manson had been here, Sirhan. And now, Richard Sallow. Miller went through the security checkpoints, metal detectors, pat-downs, badge verification, the endless clanking of heavy steel doors. He was escorted to a small interrogation room in the maximum security wing. It was a windowless box, painted a depressing shade of institutional green. A metal table was bolted to the floor, 2 chairs. Miller sat down. He took out his file. He took out the photo of Elena. He placed it face down on the table. He took out the mugshot from 1984. He placed it face up. He waited. 10 minutes passed. Then the door buzzed and opened. 2 guards led a man in. Richard Sallow was 61 years old now, but he looked 80. His hair was grey and thinning, pulled back into a ponytail. His skin was papery and pale, the result of decades without direct sunlight. But the eyes were the same, black holes. He wore an orange jumpsuit with CDCR prisoner stenciled on the back. He shuffled in, shackles clinking around his ankles. The guard sat him down and chained his wrist to the table loop. "You have an hour, detective," the guard said, then stepped out, leaving them alone. Sallow rubbed his wrist. He looked at Miller with a bored expression. "Riverside," Sallow rasped. His voice was like grinding stones. "Don't know anyone in Riverside. Never been there." "You're a long way from home, cop," Sallow said, leaning back. "What do you want?" "I got an appeal coming up. Unless you're here to confess to framing me for the 92 beef, I ain't interested." November 3rd, 1984. The Blue Room Bar, Riverside. You got drunk. You got into a fight. You got thrown in the tank. So?
I drank a lot in the 80s. I was a musician, part of the lifestyle. You were driving a blue Ford Econoline van with a silver stripe. Everybody had a van. You were traveling with a girl from Dayton, Ohio. She wanted to be a photographer. I traveled with lots of girls, groupies. They came and went. This one didn't go, Richard, Miller said. This one ran. If she ran, she ran. Not my problem. She ran because she was scared of you, Miller said, his voice dropping lower, harder. She got on a bus. She tried to get away. But you found her. You got out of jail on the morning of the 4th. You were angry. You had no money. Your van was broken down. And you knew she was in town. I don't know what you're talking about, Sallow said, but he was shifting in his chair now. The boredom was gone, replaced by a wary tension. We found her, Richard, Miller lied. Well, a half-lie. They had found her body. We found her in a field, beaten, strangled, left in the mud like garbage. Sallow looked away. He looked at the wall. Sad story. Nothing to do with me. Miller reached out and flipped over the photo of Elena Vance. The vibrant, smiling face stared up at them. Her name, Miller said, slamming his hand on the table, making Sallow jump, is Elena Vance. Sallow stared at the photo. For a second, just a split second, the mask slipped. Miller saw it. He saw the recognition. He saw the memory of that face surfacing from the sludge of 35 years. I never knew her name, Sallow muttered. Liar, Miller hissed. You drove her halfway across the country. You promised her the world, and when she tried to leave, you killed her. I didn't kill nobody. She left me. She took my stash, and she took off. I never saw her again. She took your stash. So you were angry. You felt she stole from you. She was a thief. She deserved what, Richard? What did she deserve? I want a lawyer. You can have a lawyer, but you just put yourself in the motive. You just admitted she stole from you, and you were angry. And I have the booking sheet placing you in Riverside, 5 miles from where her body was found, on the day she died. I have the bus ticket proving she went there. And now, thanks to DNA, I have the victim identified. We're going to run your DNA against the scrapings from under her fingernails, Richard. Technology has come a long way. If you touched her, if you even breathed on her, we're going to know. I'm going to take you back to Riverside, Miller said. I'm going to put you in a courtroom, and I'm going to introduce you to her brother, Thomas. And then I'm going to watch them add another life sentence to your tab. We're done for now, Miller said. He walked out, leaving Sallow chained to the table, staring at the empty space where Elena's photo had been. As Miller walked out into the blinding California sun, he pulled out his phone. He dialed Henderson back in Riverside. Miller, where are you? California, Miller said. I found him. He slipped up. He admitted knowing her, admitted a conflict. It's circumstantial, but it's a start. And the DNA? Henderson asked. I bluffed him on the DNA, Miller said, unlocking the rental car. But here's the thing. If he kept anything of hers, a trophy. Guys like this always keep a trophy. 595. After 30 years? 596. He's been in prison since 92. 597. His personal effects would be in storage, either here at the prison or with a next of kin. We need a warrant for his property box. I'll wake up the DA, Henderson said. Good work, Frank. Miller got in the car. He felt a wave of exhaustion crash over him, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came after a long day of heavy lifting. He looked at the passenger seat. The file was there. Elena Vance. We got him, Elena, Miller said to the quiet interior of the car. We got him. He started the engine and drove toward the exit. He had a flight to catch. He had a warrant to write. And he had a cold case box that needed a new label. It would look good in block letters.